The millionaire mocked the street vendor, but sometime later, he discovered who the vendor was, and he regretted what he had done right away. What happened next changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting stories like this one. The aroma of freshly baked chocolate cake wafted through the crisp London air as Victoria Blackwood arranged her modest display of homemade treats on a small folding table. Her weathered hands, adorned with a single gold wedding band, moved with practiced precision despite the morning chill. To passers-by, she appeared to be nothing more than another elderly street vendor trying to make ends meet, exactly as she intended. The location she had chosen was no accident, directly outside the Golden Fork, one of London's most prestigious restaurants in Mayfair. The establishment's elegant facade, with its gold-leafed lettering and pristine windows, provided a stark contrast to her humble setup. Victoria adjusted her simple grey wool coat and patted down her silver hair, carefully styled to look somewhat unkempt. From her vantage point, she could observe the steady stream of London's elite entering and exiting the restaurant. Some barely glanced her way, while others wrinkled their noses in displeasure at her presence. Victoria had learned more about human nature in the past year of selling sweets than in decades of running board meetings. Inside her modest handbag lay a phone worth more than most people's monthly salary, and a discreet earpiece through which she occasionally received updates from her assistant, Diana Preston. "The board meeting for Harrison Development's acquisition is scheduled for next week, Mrs. Blackwood." Diana's voice came through clearly. "They're still unaware of your majority stakeholder position." "Thank you, Diana," Victoria whispered, appearing to adjust her scarf while speaking. "And the background check on Emma Collins?" "Impeccable, ma'am. 5 years at Harrison Development, promoted twice on merit alone. She's been volunteering at the Children's Hospital every weekend for the past 3 years. Victoria smiled, remembering the young woman who had become a regular customer over the past few months. Emma always stopped to chat, asking about Victoria's day and sharing stories about her work in real estate development, unaware she was speaking to one of the industry's most influential figures. The lunch hour approached, and with it came James Harrison himself, CEO of Harrison Development. Victoria had watched him for weeks now, noting how he treated everyone around him. Today, he wore his usual bespoke suit, Italian leather shoes gleaming in the winter sun. He was handsome in a conventional way, but his face carried a perpetual expression of barely concealed disdain. As he approached the restaurant entrance, Victoria observed his interaction with the doorman, a curt nod without eye contact. A young intern scurried after him, arms full of documents, receiving nothing but criticism for her efforts. These small moments told Victoria everything she needed to know about James Harrison's character. The restaurant's maitre d' spotted Victoria's table and frowned. She had become a point of contention over the past weeks, but her permits were in order, and there was legally nothing they could do about her presence. Besides, several of their regular customers had developed a fondness for her treats, particularly her chocolate truffles. Emma Collins typically arrived around 1 o'clock, and today was no exception. She emerged from a taxi, her navy business suit slightly wrinkled from a morning of meetings. Despite her obvious fatigue, she greeted Victoria with a warm smile. "Mrs. Rose," Emma called out, using the alias Victoria had given her. "I've been looking forward to your chocolate cake all morning. The office could certainly use some sweetness today." Victoria beamed at her approach. "Dear Emma, you look like you've had quite the morning. The usual slice." "Yes, please. And maybe an extra truffle or two." Emma leaned in conspiratorially. "Mr. Harrison has been particularly demanding today. We're in the middle of a massive development project, and he's making everyone's life difficult." As Victoria carefully packed Emma's treats, she asked gentle questions about the young woman's work, storing away each detail. Emma spoke about her dreams of making affordable housing more accessible, of incorporating green spaces into urban development. Her eyes lit up when discussing sustainability initiatives she hoped to implement someday. "You know, dear," Victoria said, handing over the package, "sometimes the biggest opportunities come disguised as something else entirely." She watched as confusion flickered across Emma's face, but before the young woman could respond, a commotion from inside the restaurant drew their attention. James Harrison was storming out, his face flushed with anger. His voice carried across the sidewalk as he berated a waiter about the temperature of his wine. Victoria straightened her spine imperceptibly, knowing the moment she had been waiting for was about to arrive. After all, she hadn't chosen this exact spot, this exact time and this exact display without careful consideration. The stage was set for what would become one of the most talked about incidents in London's business circle, though not for the reasons anyone watching might expect. Victoria Blackwood, hidden beneath her carefully crafted disguise as Mrs. Rose, was about to teach everyone present a lesson about the true nature of success and character. Emma checked her watch and reluctantly turned toward the restaurant. "I should head in for my lunch meeting. Thank you, Mrs. Rose. Your treats always make the day better." "Good luck, dear," Victoria replied, watching as Emma disappeared through the golden doors. She then turned her attention back to James Harrison, who was now ending his tirade against the restaurant staff. The real test of character was about to begin, and Victoria was ready to witness every moment of it. James Harrison's day had gone from bad to worse. The wine incident at the Golden Fork was merely the latest in a series of irritations that had plagued him since morning. The quarterly reports showed concerning numbers, and the board was breathing down his neck about the new development project in Chelsea. As he stormed out of the restaurant, his designer shoes clicking against the pavement, his gaze fell upon Victoria's modest display of baked goods. The sight of it, this shabby table with its homemade signs and plastic containers, seemed to personally offend him. It was, in his mind, an affront to the prestigious establishment he frequented. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. His hand instinctively reached for his phone, already planning to call the local council about street vendor regulations. Victoria watched him approach, her experienced eyes noting every detail of his demeanor. Through her earpiece, Diana's voice came in a whisper. "Mrs. Blackwood, should I have the car ready?" "Not yet," Victoria murmured, appearing to adjust her scarf. "Let's see how this plays out." Inside the restaurant, Emma had just settled at her table when she noticed the commotion building outside. Through the window, she could see Mr. Harrison approaching Mrs. Rose's stand, his body language radiating hostility. "How long have you been setting up this?" James gestured dismissively at her display. "This eyesore here?" Victoria smiled pleasantly, her dignified demeanor unchanged. "Just trying to bring a little sweetness to people's days, sir. Would you like to try a chocolate truffle? They're made with Belgian chocolate. Do you have any idea what your presence does to the image of this establishment?" James's voice grew louder, attracting attention from passers-by. "This is Mayfair, not some street market in Camden." Inside the restaurant, Emma rose from her table, concern etched across her face. Several other diners had also turned to watch the scene unfolding on the sidewalk. Victoria remained calm, her hands folded carefully on the table. "I have all the proper permits, sir. Perhaps you'd like to see them." James's face reddened further. "Permits? Do you think I care about permits? This is about standards, about maintaining the proper atmosphere for legitimate businesses." His hand swept across the table, sending several displays of carefully arranged truffles tumbling to the ground. A collective gasp arose from the growing crowd of onlookers. Emma had reached the restaurant's door by now, her hand pushing it open. Victoria looked down at her scattered treats, then back up at James Harrison. For a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear or sadness, but something far more dangerous. Purpose. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice carrying a new tone that made him pause momentarily. "Would you say this display accurately represents who you are as a person?" The question caught him off guard, but he quickly recovered. "Who I am. I am James Harrison, CEO of Harrison Development. I've built towers that have changed London's skyline. And you're nothing but a nuisance selling subpar sweets on the street." Emma had reached them by now, already kneeling to help pick up the scattered truffles. "Mr. Harrison, please, this isn't necessary," she pleaded, her voice firm despite addressing her boss. "Miss Collins, stay out of this," James snapped, "unless you want your career prospects at Harrison Development to become as scattered as these chocolates." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly at the threat. Through her earpiece, Diana's voice came again. "Everything is being recorded, Mrs. Blackwood. The board will receive the footage within the hour." More people had gathered now, many filming the incident on their phones. James Harrison, too, caught up in his self-righteous anger, failed to notice how many witnesses were documenting his behavior. "You know," Victoria said, her voice taking on an almost contemplative tone, I've found that life has a peculiar way of teaching us lessons about humility. Sometimes, Mr. Harrison, the person you're looking down upon today might be signing your checks tomorrow. James laughed derisively. Is that supposed to be some kind of threat? From a street vendor? Emma, still helping to clean up the mess, looked between them with growing confusion. There was something about Mrs. Rose's demeanor that seemed different, a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with her humble appearance. Victoria began carefully packing up her remaining displays. Not a threat, Mr. Harrison. Merely an observation about the nature of fate. Miss Collins, she turned to Emma, thank you for your kindness. It will be remembered. You're leaving? Emma asked, concerned. Don't let him bully you away. Oh, I'm not leaving permanently, Victoria replied, a small smile playing at her lips. I believe I've seen everything I needed to see here. She turned back to James. Mr. Harrison, I want you to remember this moment. Remember exactly how you chose to treat someone you believed was beneath you. James scoffed, straightening his tie. Are you finished with your little sermon? Because I have actual business to attend to. Real business, not this pathetic attempt at— The only pathetic thing I see here, Victoria interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that made several onlookers straighten instinctively, is a man so insecure in his position that he feels the need to belittle others to feel important. With that, she gathered her belongings with deliberate care, nodding graciously to those who had witnessed the scene. As she turned to leave, she paused beside Emma. Sometimes, my dear, the greatest opportunities come to those who show kindness when they think no one is watching. James watched her go, a nagging sense of unease beginning to penetrate his anger. Something about her final words, the way she had carried herself, it didn't fit the image of a simple street vendor. But he quickly dismissed the thought, turning on his heel to return to the restaurant. What he didn't see was Victoria sliding into a sleek black car around the corner, where Diana Preston waited with a tablet already displaying emails from concerned board members who had received anonymous footage of the incident. The wheels of change had been set in motion, and James Harrison had no idea that his empire had just begun to crumble. The morning after the incident, Victoria Blackwood sat in her penthouse office overlooking the Thames, watching the early sunlight glint off the river's surface. Gone was the grey wool coat and simple dress, replaced by a perfectly tailored Chanel suit. Her silver hair was elegantly styled, and her posture spoke of decades commanding boardrooms. The video has gone viral, Mrs. Blackwood, Diana reported, sliding a tablet across the polished mahogany desk. It's been picked up by several business news outlets. CEO's tirade against elderly vendor sparks outrage seems to be the running headline. Victoria smiled, picking up her bone china teacup. And the board members? They've called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. Several have expressed serious concerns about Mr. Harrison's behavior affecting company reputation. They don't yet know of your majority shareholding, of course. Excellent. Victoria turned to the floor-to-ceiling windows. And Emma Collins? Diana's professional demeanor softened slightly. She tried to find you this morning at your usual spot. When you weren't there, she left a note with the restaurant's maitre d'. It's quite touching, actually. She's worried about you. Victoria felt a warm satisfaction in her chest. Every interaction with Emma had confirmed her initial impressions of the young woman's character. Have our people finished the background check on her family? Yes, ma'am. Her mother was a school teacher, father a civil engineer, both retired now. Emma worked 3 jobs to put herself through university, graduated top of her class from LSE. She's been supporting her younger sister through medical school. Perfect, Victoria murmured. Schedule a lunch meeting with her next week. Not as Mrs. Rose, of course, as Victoria Blackwood, major shareholder interested in discussing the company's future. Meanwhile, at Harrison Development's headquarters, James Harrison was facing the most challenging morning of his career. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since he'd woken up to find his face plastered across social media. His actions from the previous day played on loop for the world to see. Sir, his assistant nervously entered his office. The board is requesting your immediate presence in the main conference room. James straightened his tie, irritation masking his growing unease. Tell them I'm in the middle of important calls. They said it's non-negotiable, sir, and there's something else. The assistant shifted uncomfortably. Miss Collins has submitted her resignation. What? James spun around. Emma Collins? From Project Development? Yes, sir. She left this morning. Several other employees have also submitted their resignations in the past hour. James sank into his chair, the reality of his situation beginning to sink in. His computer pinged with another email, this one from their largest client, expressing serious concerns about their ongoing partnership. In another part of the city, Emma sat in her small flat, staring at her laptop screen. Job offers had been pouring in since the video went viral, her stance against her boss's behavior, catching the attention of several prominent firms. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Mrs. Rose. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister, Sarah. "Have you seen this?" Attached was a link to a business article about Harrison Development's plummeting stock prices. Emma sighed, clicking the link. As she read, an email notification popped up on her screen. The sender's name made her sit up straight. Victoria Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Enterprises. "Dear Miss Collins," she read, her heart racing. "In light of recent events, I would like to discuss a potential opportunity with you. Your handling of yesterday's unfortunate incident demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership qualities our organization values." Back in her office, Victoria was reviewing the final details of her plan with Diana. "Have legal prepared the necessary documents for the board meeting? I want everything ready when I make my appearance." "Already done, Mrs. Blackwood, though I must ask, why go to all this trouble? You could have simply bought Harrison Development outright months ago." Victoria touched the wedding ring she still wore, her thoughts momentarily drifting to Charles. "My husband used to say that true character reveals itself not in grand gestures but in small moments, when we think no one is watching." She smiled softly. "I needed to see who people truly were, Diana, not who they pretended to be in boardrooms and business meetings." Diana nodded, understanding dawning on her face. "And the street vendor disguise? Charles and I built our empire from nothing. We never forgot what it was like to struggle, to be looked down upon. After he passed, I realized how many of today's business leaders have lost touch with that humanity." Victoria stood, gathering her papers. "Sometimes people need a reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that kindness should be a constant, not a convenience." As the morning wore on, London's business world was abuzz with speculation. Why had Harrison Development stock suddenly become so volatile? Who was buying up shares at an unprecedented rate? And why were headhunters suddenly so interested in a mid-level executive named Emma Collins? In the midst of this chaos, Victoria Blackwood prepared for the board meeting that would change everything. Her driver was already waiting downstairs, ready to take her to Harrison Development's headquarters. In her briefcase were documents that would reshape the company's future, and in her mind was the image of Emma's kindness, James's cruelty, and the perfect justice she was about to deliver. The stage was set for a revelation that would shake London's business community to its core, and at the center of it all was a woman who had proven that sometimes the most powerful moves in business come disguised as humble offerings of chocolate truffles on a Mayfair street corner. The Harrison Development boardroom, with its mahogany table and leather chairs, had witnessed countless power plays over the years, but none quite like what was about to unfold on this particular afternoon. James Harrison sat at the head of the table, his usual confidence notably diminished as board members filed in, their faces grave. "This is a disaster," board member Thompson was saying, waving a tablet displaying the latest stock figures. "Our share price has dropped 15% since the video went viral. Major clients are threatening to pull out." "It was a minor incident that's been blown out of proportion," James insisted, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "The media cycle will move on." "A minor incident?" Rebecca Chen, another board member, raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Harrison, we've received over 50 complaints from major stakeholders. The public relations nightmare aside, this behavior goes against everything our corporate ethics code stands for." The room fell silent as Diana Preston entered, her professional demeanor commanding immediate attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but Victoria Blackwood has requested to join this meeting." The effect of that name was electric. Victoria Blackwood was legendary in London's business circles, though few had actually met her in recent years. Her company, Blackwood Enterprises, was known for its strategic acquisitions and ethical business practices. James felt his throat tighten. Victoria Blackwood? What could she possibly want with this meeting? His question was answered as Victoria herself walked through the door, and James's world tilted on its axis. Gone was the grey wool coat and humble demeanour of the street vendor. In their place stood an elegant, commanding presence in a perfectly tailored suit, her silver hair styled immaculately. But the eyes, those same eyes that had watched him make the biggest mistake of his career, were unmistakable. "Mrs. Blackwood," Board Member Thompson rose quickly. "This is an unexpected honour." Victoria smiled, but her eyes remained fixed on James, who had gone deathly pale. "Please, remain seated. I believe we have much to discuss." She took a seat directly opposite James. "Mr. Harrison, you seem surprised to see me. Perhaps you'd prefer if I were selling chocolates outside the Golden Fork." The board members exchanged confused glances until Diana smoothly distributed a folder to each person. "Ladies and gentlemen, over the past year, Blackwood Enterprises has acquired a controlling interest in Harrison Development through various shell companies and investment vehicles. As of this morning, Mrs. Blackwood holds 51% of all voting shares." The room erupted in murmurs. James gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. "This is impossible. We would have known." "Would you?" Victoria's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "The same way you knew the true identity of the woman you publicly humiliated yesterday? The world is full of surprises, Mr. Harrison, particularly for those who judge solely by appearances." She opened her own folder, her movements deliberate and precise. "I've spent the past year evaluating this company's culture and its leadership. Not from this boardroom, but from the streets. What I discovered was a disturbing disconnect between Harrison Development's stated values and the actual behavior of its CEO. If I may," Rebecca Chen interjected, "why go to such lengths? Why the disguise?" Victoria's expression softened slightly. "After my husband's passing, I realized that true character reveals itself not in boardroom presentations or annual reports, but in small, unguarded moments. How do people treat others when they think it doesn't matter? Who shows kindness without expecting anything in return?" She pressed a button on the table, and a screen descended from the ceiling. Security footage began playing, showing various employees' interactions with Mrs. Rose over the past year. Emma Collins featured prominently, sharing her lunch, helping to set up the display during rain, defending the elderly vendor to annoyed restaurant staff. While Mr. Harrison saw a nuisance to be removed, others saw a human being worthy of dignity and respect. The contrast was illuminating. Victoria turned to Diana, who distributed another set of documents. "These are the formal papers calling for an immediate vote on leadership change." James finally found his voice. "This is absurd. You can't possibly expect the board to take this seriously. One incident that perfectly exemplified a pattern of behavior," Victoria interrupted. "Your treatment of employees, your disdain for those you consider beneath you, your focus on appearance over substance, all of it has been documented. The only absurdity is that you believe position and power excuse basic human decency." The board members were already reviewing the documents, their expressions growing more serious with each page. Victoria continued, her voice carrying years of boardroom authority. "Harrison Development was founded with a vision of creating spaces that bring people together. Somewhere along the way, under current leadership, it lost sight of that mission. I intend to restore it." She turned to address the entire board. "I am proposing an immediate leadership transition. The company needs someone who understands both the business and the human element of development. Someone who sees opportunity in innovation and value in every person, regardless of their position." James laughed bitterly. "And I suppose you have someone in mind?" "Let me guess. That junior executive who was so concerned about your chocolates." "Emma Collins has demonstrated every quality this company desperately needs," Victoria replied calmly. "Intelligence, compassion, innovation, and most importantly, integrity. Her background in sustainable development and community-focused projects is exactly what Harrison Development requires to move forward." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. James Harrison, the man who had built his reputation on luxury developments and exclusive properties, was about to be replaced by someone who believed in accessible housing and community spaces. The irony was lost on no one. Victoria stood, smoothing her jacket. "I'm calling for an immediate vote on the leadership transition. As majority shareholder, my position is clear, but I believe in transparency and collective decision-making." The choice is yours, but remember, in today's world, character and ethics are not just moral imperatives, they're good business. As the board members began their deliberations, Victoria caught Diana's eye and nodded slightly. Phase 1 was complete. Now it was time to set the next part of her plan in motion. The part that would not just change Harrison Development, but potentially reshape London's entire approach to urban development. And somewhere across the city, Emma Collins's phone was ringing with a call that would change her life forever. Emma Collins sat at her small kitchen table, surrounded by job applications and offer letters from various development firms. Her laptop displayed yet another email from a recruiter, but her mind kept wandering back to Mrs. Rose. The memory of yesterday's incident still made her stomach clench with anger. Her sister Sarah's voice crackled through her phone's speaker. "I still can't believe you resigned, though after seeing that video, I would have done the same thing. Have you decided which offer you're going to accept?" "Not yet," Emma sighed, stirring her now cold tea. "Something doesn't feel right about any of them. They all seem more interested in the publicity of hiring the woman who stood up to James Harrison than in my actual ideas about sustainable development." Her phone buzzed with another call. She glanced at the screen, not recognizing the number. "Sarah, I should take this. It might be another recruiter. Good luck. Call me later with any news." Emma answered the call, expecting another enthusiastic headhunter. Instead, a familiar voice made her freeze. "Miss Collins? This is Diana Preston, Executive Assistant to Victoria Blackwood. Mrs. Blackwood would like to meet with you this afternoon, if you're available." Her heart began racing. Victoria Blackwood was a legend in the industry, known for her innovative approaches to urban development and ethical business practices. "This afternoon?" Emma glanced down at her casual weekend clothes. Yes, of course. What time?" "A car will arrive at your address in 1 hour, if that's convenient. The meeting will take place at Blackwood Enterprises." Emma spent the next 45 minutes in a flurry of activity, changing outfits 3 times before settling on her best suit. Her mind raced with possibilities. Why would Victoria Blackwood want to meet with her? The woman was known for being incredibly selective about her meetings, sometimes refusing to see even high-level executives. The black car that arrived was understated but elegant, much like the Blackwood Enterprises building itself. As Emma was led through the lobby, she noticed how different it felt from Harrison Development's ostentatious headquarters. Here, the atmosphere was one of quiet efficiency and purpose. Diana Preston met her at the elevator, her professional demeanor softened by a warm smile. "Miss Collins, thank you for coming on such short notice. Mrs. Blackwood is looking forward to meeting you." The executive floor was a study in tasteful design, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering stunning views of London. Emma was led to a comfortable meeting room where a tea service had been arranged, and there, standing by the window, was Victoria Blackwood. Emma's first impression was one of quiet authority. There was something familiar about the way the older woman carried herself, something that tickled at the edge of her memory. "Miss Collins," Victoria turned, smiling. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat. How do you take your tea?" As Victoria poured the tea herself, rather than delegating to Diana, Emma found herself relaxing slightly. "Mrs. Blackwood, I have to admit I'm curious about why you wanted to meet with me." Direct and honest, good qualities. Victoria sat across from her. "Tell me, Miss Collins, what do you believe is the true purpose of urban development?" Emma barely hesitated. This was something she'd thought about countless times. To create spaces that serve communities, not just profits. Development should enhance lives, not just skylines. We have a responsibility to build sustainably, to consider the social impact of our projects, and to ensure that growth doesn't mean displacement. Victoria's eyes sparkled with approval. And how were these views received at Harrison Development? They weren't, usually. Mr. Harrison was more interested in luxury developments and exclusive properties. Emma paused, then decided to be completely honest. "I was actually working on a proposal for affordable housing integrated with green spaces, but I never submitted it. I knew it would be rejected." "I'd like to see that proposal," Victoria said, surprising Emma. "But first I have something to show you." She pressed a button, and a screen descended from the ceiling. Emma watched in confusion as security footage began playing, footage of Mrs. Rose's stand outside the Golden Fork. I don't understand, Emma began, but then fell silent as she watched herself on screen, helping the elderly vendor set up her display during a rainy day, sharing lunch breaks, defending her to annoyed restaurant staff, and then yesterday's incident with James Harrison. Slowly, Emma turned to look at Victoria, really look at her. The elegant business attire was different, the posture more commanding, but those eyes, they were the same ones that had twinkled at her over chocolate truffles. "Mrs. Rose?" she whispered, stunned. Victoria smiled. "Among other things. Though I prefer Victoria these days." She leaned forward. "Emma, what I'm about to tell you will seem extraordinary, but I ask that you listen with an open mind. As of this morning, I am the majority shareholder of Harrison Development. The board is currently voting on a leadership transition, and I have recommended you as the new CEO." Emma's teacup clattered against its saucer. What? But I'm just a mid-level executive. I don't have the experience." "You have exactly the experience we need," Victoria interrupted gently. "You understand both the business and humanitarian aspects of development. You've shown innovation, integrity, and most importantly, the ability to see value in every person, regardless of their apparent status." She slid a folder across the table. "This contains my proposal for your role in the company's future. Take it home, read it carefully, discuss it with your family. But know this, I didn't choose you because of yesterday's incident. I chose you because of all the days before that, when you showed kindness and integrity without knowing anyone was watching." Emma opened the folder with trembling hands, her eyes widening at the contents. The salary figure alone was staggering, but it was the outlined vision for the company's future that caught her attention. Sustainable development, community integration, affordable housing initiatives. Everything she had dreamed of implementing. "I don't know what to say," she managed finally. "Say you'll consider it," Victoria replied. "The company needs transformation, and you've shown you have both the vision and the character to lead that change." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though I will miss our chats over chocolate truffles." Emma laughed, still somewhat dazed. "I still have so many questions." "And we have time to address them all," Victoria assured her. "But for now, take the proposal home. Read it through. The car will take you back when you're ready." As Emma gathered her things to leave, still trying to process everything that had happened, Victoria added one final comment. "Oh, and Emma, sometimes the most important meetings of our lives happen not in boardrooms, but on street corners over homemade chocolates." Emma left the building in a daze, the folder clutched to her chest, her mind spinning with possibilities. The London skyline seemed different somehow, full of potential and promise, and somewhere in her bag, her phone was already buzzing with a message from Sarah, eager to hear about the mysterious meeting. The wheels of change were truly in motion now, and Emma Collins was about to become a key part of a transformation that would reshape not just Harrison Development, but the entire landscape of London's real estate industry. The news spread through Harrison Development like wildfire. James Harrison had been voted out by the board, and his replacement was none other than Emma Collins, the same Emma Collins who, just days ago, had been a mid-level executive fighting to be heard in project meetings. The transition team arrived early Monday morning, led by Diana Preston, whose efficiency was already legendary within the building. James Harrison stood in his office, supervising his personal items being packed into boxes, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "This is temporary," he muttered to his assistant, who was helping gather his awards and certificates. "They'll realize their mistake within weeks. That girl has no idea how to run a company of this size." Down in the main conference room, Emma sat beside Victoria, addressing the senior management team. Gone was the nervous energy of a junior executive. In its place was a quiet confidence born of preparation and purpose. "I understand this transition may seem sudden," Emma began, her voice clear and steady, "but I want to assure everyone that our company's stability remains our top priority. However, there will be changes, necessary ones that will position us for sustainable growth." Victoria watched with approval as Emma handled the questions that followed. Each response was thoughtful, showing both business acumen and emotional intelligence. The senior managers, initially skeptical, began to lean in, engaged by her vision. "Our first priority," Emma continued, pulling up a presentation, "is the Riverside Development Project. Instead of the original luxury-only plan, we're going to implement a mixed-use development model that includes affordable housing, green spaces, and community facilities. One of the senior directors raised his hand. Miss Collins, the profit margins on luxury developments are significantly higher. The shareholders will benefit from long-term sustainable growth and positive community impact, Victoria interjected smoothly. I should know. I am, after all, the majority shareholder. The room fell silent as the full impact of Victoria's presence hit home. This wasn't just a young executive's idealistic vision. It had the full backing of one of London's most successful business leaders. Meanwhile, on the executive floor, James was having his final confrontation with reality. Through the glass walls of his former office, he watched as maintenance workers carefully removed his name from the door. Mr. Harrison, Diana approached him with a final set of documents. These require your signature for the formal transition of power. As he signed, his hand trembling slightly with suppressed emotion, James couldn't help but ask, why her? Of all people, why Emma Collins? Diana's professional mask slipped just slightly, showing a hint of satisfaction. Perhaps, Mr. Harrison, because she understood something you never did. That true leadership isn't about looking down on people, but about lifting them up. Back in the conference room, Emma was outlining her first 100 days plan. The energy in the room had shifted from skepticism to cautious optimism, as she detailed initiatives that balanced profit with purpose. We're not just building buildings, she explained, pointing to architectural renders on the screen. We're creating communities. Every development should contribute positively to its neighborhood, not just its investors. Victoria smiled, remembering similar conversations over chocolate truffles outside the Golden Fork. Emma had shared these dreams then, never knowing she was speaking to someone who could help make them reality. The day continued with a flurry of activities. Department heads were briefed, press statements were prepared, and project teams were reorganized. Through it all, Emma moved with a sense of purpose that inspired confidence in those around her. By late afternoon, James Harrison's personal items had been removed from the building. As he stood on the sidewalk waiting for his car, he found himself looking at the spot where Victoria had set up her chocolate stand. The irony was not lost on him. Inside, Emma was settling into her new office. Not James's old one, but a smaller space she had chosen on a lower floor, closer to the project teams. She'd requested that the executive floor be converted into a collaborative workspace for sustainable design initiatives. Victoria found her there, arranging a few personal items on her desk. Among them was a small box of chocolate truffles, identical to the ones that had once been scattered across a Mayfair sidewalk. A reminder, Victoria asked, gesturing to the chocolates. Emma smiled, of where this journey began, and of the lesson that every person, regardless of their apparent position, deserves respect and kindness. Speaking of positions, Victoria sat down across from her. How are you feeling about yours? Overwhelmed, Emma admitted honestly, but ready. I've been thinking about these changes for years, dreaming about how we could do things differently. Now we actually can. Victoria nodded approvingly. That's exactly why you're here. But remember, change doesn't happen overnight. Take it step by step, build your team, and stay true to your vision. As if on cue, Diana entered with a stack of project proposals. The Riverside development team is ready for your review, Miss Collins, and the press is requesting statements about the company's new direction. Emma straightened in her chair, ready to face these new challenges. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over London's skyline, a skyline that, under her leadership, would soon begin to change in ways that would benefit not just the wealthy few, but the entire community. The wheels of change were turning, and Emma Collins was ready to steer them in the right direction. The era of Harrison Development's focus on luxury and exclusivity was over. A new chapter was beginning, one that would prove that success in business could go hand in hand with social responsibility and human dignity. 3 weeks into her new role as CEO, Emma Collins stood before the scale model of the Riverside Development Project, now completely redesigned under her direction. The original plans for luxury-only apartments had been transformed into a vibrant mixed-use community space that included affordable housing, green areas, and local business opportunities. The environmental impact assessment came back positive. Marcus Chen, her newly appointed head of sustainable development, reported, "The solar panel integration and rainwater harvesting systems will reduce the carbon footprint by 60% compared to traditional developments." Emma nodded, studying the model's intricate details. "And the community feedback?" "Overwhelmingly positive," Diana chimed in, handling her tablet. "The local council is particularly impressed with the planned community center and public garden spaces. However," she hesitated. "What is it, Diana?" "Several of our traditional investors are expressing concerns about the projected profit margins. They're used to Harrison's luxury-focused approach. James Harrison has been reaching out to them personally." Emma straightened, processing this information. She'd known James wouldn't disappear quietly, but direct interference with investors was a bold move. "Schedule a meeting with the investment team. We need to show them that sustainable development can be profitable too." Meanwhile, across town in his Mayfair penthouse, James Harrison was indeed plotting his return. His home office had become a command center of sorts, walls covered with financial reports and investor profiles. "They're making a mistake," he muttered to Richard Thompson, a former board member who had remained loyal to him. "Collins is going to run that company into the ground with her charitable initiatives and community focus." "Several major investors share your concerns," Thompson replied, reviewing documents on his laptop. "The Riverside development changes alone have made them nervous. If we can prove her approach is financially unsound." Back at Harrison Development, now unofficially being called HD New Era by employees, Victoria Blackwood was having tea with Emma in the newly renovated collaborative workspace that had once been the executive floor. "James has been busy," Victoria remarked, stirring her tea. "3 of our major investors have requested emergency meetings." Emma sighed. "I expected resistance, but this feels coordinated." "He's trying to undermine everything we're doing." "Of course he is," Victoria smiled. "And that's exactly why we prepared for this. Show me the new financial projections." Emma pulled out a comprehensive presentation she had prepared. While the initial investment in sustainable technology and community spaces was higher, the long-term projections showed steady, sustainable growth. More importantly, the new approach had attracted a different kind of investor, ones more interested in long-term stability than quick profits. "Look at these numbers," Emma pointed out. "The sustainable features will reduce maintenance costs by 40% over 10 years. The mixed-use spaces ensure steady rental income even during market downturns, and the community integration increases property values throughout the entire neighborhood." Victoria nodded approvingly. "You're not just building properties, you're building ecosystems. That's what James never understood. Real estate isn't just about buildings, it's about creating spaces where communities can thrive." Their discussion was interrupted by Diana rushing in, looking concerned. "Emma, you need to see this. James Harrison just gave an interview to the Financial Times. He's questioning your experience and suggesting that the company's new direction is dangerously idealistic." Emma felt her stomach tighten, but years of fighting for her ideas had taught her resilience. "Schedule a press conference for tomorrow. It's time we showed everyone exactly what dangerously idealistic can achieve." The next morning, Emma stood before a crowd of journalists, investors, and community representatives. Behind her was a massive screen displaying the Riverside development plans, along with detailed financial projections and sustainability metrics. "Some have suggested that our new approach is idealistic," she began, her voice clear and confident. "They're right. We are idealistic enough to believe that profit and purpose can coexist, that development can serve both shareholders and communities. That success can be measured not just in pounds, but in lives improved." She clicked to the next slide, showing comparative data. "Our new approach will reduce operating costs by 40% over 10 years. Our mixed-use developments ensure stable income regardless of market conditions. And our community integration approach has already attracted new investors who share our vision for sustainable, responsible growth." Victoria, watching from the side, smiled as she saw the journalists furiously taking notes. Emma had transformed from the quiet executive selling chocolates on street corners into a leader capable of defending her vision with passion and precision. In his penthouse, James Harrison watched the press conference with growing frustration. His phone buzzed. Another investor backing out of his plan to challenge the new leadership. "She's good," Thompson admitted reluctantly. The numbers make sense, and she's winning over the press with this community-focused approach. Back at the press conference, Emma was concluding her presentation. We're not just changing how we build, we're changing why we build. And I invite everyone who believes in responsible, sustainable development to join us on this journey. The applause was thunderous. Even the most skeptical financial journalists were nodding appreciatively at the detailed projections and innovative approaches presented. Later that evening, as Emma reviewed the day's press coverage with her team, Victoria appeared with a familiar box of chocolate truffles. "Celebrating?" Emma asked, smiling at the sight. "Remembering," Victoria corrected. "Sometimes we need to remind ourselves where we came from to be sure about where we're going." Emma took one of the truffles, its taste bringing back memories of conversations on street corners and dreams of changing the industry. Now those dreams were becoming reality, one project at a time. The sun was setting over London, casting long shadows through the office windows. In the distance, cranes stood like sentinels over construction sites that would soon become not just buildings but communities. The winds of change were blowing strong, and neither James Harrison nor anyone else could stop them now. 6 months had passed since Emma Collins took the helm of Harrison Development, and the changes were becoming visible across London. The Riverside development's first phase was nearing completion, its innovative design already attracting international attention. Solar panels gleamed on rooftops, community gardens bloomed in previously unused spaces, and a mix of residents from different economic backgrounds had begun moving into the completed sections. Emma stood at the site wearing a hard hat and safety vest, surrounded by a group of international journalists. The BBC was doing a special feature on innovative urban development, and HD New Era, as the company was now officially known, was their prime example. The key was rethinking what luxury means, Emma explained, gesturing to the development around them. True luxury isn't about exclusivity, it's about quality of life. When you create spaces where communities can thrive, where children have safe places to play, where elderly residents can enjoy green spaces, that's real luxury. Victoria Blackwood, standing at the back of the group, smiled proudly. The young woman she'd first met selling chocolates had blossomed into a visionary leader, proving her instincts right. But across town, in a private members' club in Mayfair, James Harrison was making his final play for power. He'd spent months gathering allies, analyzing financial reports, and waiting for any sign of weakness in the new leadership. "The shareholders' meeting next week is our chance," he told his small group of supporters. "I found a potential flaw in how the Sustainable Development Fund was structured. If we can prove financial mismanagement." Meanwhile, back at the construction site, Emma was showing the journalists the community centre, her passion evident in every word. This space will host job training programs, childcare facilities, and senior citizen activities. "We're not just building apartments, we're building a support system." Diana approached discreetly, tablet in hand. "Emma, we've received intelligence about James Harrison's plans for the shareholders' meeting. He's going to challenge the Sustainable Development Fund's structure." Emma's expression remained calm, though her mind was already racing through contingencies. Victoria joined them, having overheard the conversation. "I wondered when he'd find that particular thread to pull," Victoria mused. "Shall we show him what we've been keeping in reserve?" Emma nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Diana, please arrange an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. It's time to reveal the full scope of Phase 2. The journalists continued their tour, unaware of the drama unfolding behind the scenes. They were too captivated by the innovative features of the development. The integrated renewable energy systems, the community-owned businesses, the urban farming initiatives. Later that afternoon, in the company's collaborative workspace, Emma stood before the board with a confidence that 6 months of successful leadership had earned her. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've all received notice of James Harrison's intended challenge at next week's shareholders' meeting," she began. "He believes he's found a weakness in our Sustainable Development Fund. What he doesn't know is that we've been running a pilot program that proves exactly why our approach isn't just ethically sound, it's financially brilliant." She clicked to the first slide, showing remarkable data from the completed sections of the Riverside development. "Our integrated community approach has resulted in rental occupancy rates of 98%, compared to the market average of 75%. Maintenance costs are down 45% due to our sustainable systems. And here's the most interesting part. Property values in the surrounding neighborhood have increased by 30%. The board members leaned forward, intrigued. Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. But the real proof is this. She revealed the next slide, showing a list of new investors, some of the biggest names in ethical investment funds globally. These funds have committed to investing in our next 5 projects, totaling over $2 billion in secured funding. They're not just investing in buildings, they're investing in our vision of sustainable, community-focused development. Victoria watched with pride as Emma handled the board's questions with expertise and grace. The young CEO had done something remarkable. She'd proven that ethical development could be wildly profitable. Across town, James Harrison's phone buzzed with messages from his remaining allies. The news of the secured funding was spreading through London's financial circles like wildfire. His carefully planned challenge was crumbling before it could even begin. Back in the boardroom, Emma was concluding her presentation. Next week, when Mr. Harrison presents his challenge, we won't just defend our approach. We'll demonstrate why it's the future of urban development. The question isn't whether sustainable, community-focused development can be profitable. We've proven it can be. The real question is, why would we ever go back to the old way? The board's approval was unanimous. As the members filed out, Victoria approached Emma with a familiar box of chocolate truffles. "Celebrating again?" Emma asked, taking one with a smile. "Always celebrate the victories," Victoria advised. "But remember, success isn't just about proving others wrong, it's about proving your beliefs right." As the sun set over London, its rays catching the solar panels of the riverside development, Emma stood at her office window, chocolate truffle in hand. The city was changing, one building at a time, one community at a time. And somewhere in Mayfair, James Harrison was realizing that his old world of exclusive luxury and profit at any cost was fading into history. The future had arrived, and it looked nothing like what he had imagined. But for Emma Collins and the communities she was helping to build, it looked exactly like a dream coming true. The morning of the shareholders' meeting dawned bright and clear over London. The company's main conference centre was filled to capacity, with additional shareholders joining via video link. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Everyone knew James Harrison would make his move today. Emma sat at the head table, reviewing her notes one final time. Victoria sat beside her, elegant as always, while Diana efficiently coordinated last-minute details. The transformation of Harrison Development into HD New Era was about to face its greatest test. "He's here," Diana whispered, as James Harrison entered the room, followed by his remaining allies. He had chosen to sit in the front row, his expression a mixture of confidence and barely concealed anger. Emma stood to begin the meeting, her voice clear and steady. "Good morning, everyone. Before we address the concerns raised by Mr. Harrison, I'd like to present our 6-month performance review." The screens around the room came to life, displaying impressive figures. "Our new approach has secured $2 billion in ethical investment funding. The riverside development is not only on schedule but under budget. Property values in our development zones have increased by an average of 30%, and our community integration programs have become a model for sustainable urban development worldwide." James Harrison rose from his seat, not waiting for the formal question period. "Impressive numbers, Miss Collins, but I think the shareholders deserve to know about the risks you're taking with their money. Your so-called Sustainable Development Fund is structured in a way that could expose us to significant losses." Emma smiled slightly, having anticipated this attack. "Actually, Mr. Harrison, I'm glad you brought that up. Victoria, would you like to explain why we structured the fund this way?" Victoria stood, commanding immediate attention. "The structure, Mr. Harrison is concerned about was actually created during his tenure as CEO. We simply repurposed it for sustainable development, the same financial mechanism he used for luxury developments we're using to build communities." A murmur ran through the crowd as James's face reddened. "That's not... You can't possibly... But we can," Emma interrupted gently. "And we have. The difference is, we're using it to create lasting value, not just quick profits." She clicked to the next slide. "Let me show you something interesting. The screen displayed a comparison between James's luxury developments and the new community-focused projects. Under the old model, we saw high initial profits but increasing vacancy rates and maintenance costs. Under our new approach, we have steady, sustainable growth, near-perfect occupancy rates, and significantly lower operating costs. James wasn't finished. He pulled out his final card. And what about the shareholders who invested in this company, expecting luxury developments? You've completely changed the company's direction without proper consultation. Actually, Victoria interjected, every major decision has been put to a board vote, and the results have been communicated to all shareholders. But perhaps it's time to address the elephant in the room. She turned to face the audience. Many of you have wondered why I chose to test potential leaders by selling chocolates on the street. The truth is, I learned this lesson from my late husband. The room fell silent, hanging on her every word. Charles Blackwood and I built our fortune from nothing. We started selling sweets from a cart in East London. Every day we watched how people treated those they thought couldn't help them advance. We learned that true character shows itself not in board meetings, but in everyday moments when people think no one important is watching. She gestured to Emma. Miss Collins showed kindness and respect, not because she thought it would advance her career, but because that's who she is. Mr. Harrison showed his true character as well, though perhaps not in the way he intended. Emma took over smoothly. We're not just building buildings anymore. We're building legacies, communities that will thrive long after we're gone. And the numbers prove that this approach isn't just ethically right, it's financially sound. She revealed the final slides, showing projections for the next 5 years. The shareholders leaned forward, clearly impressed by the figures. Our ethical investment partnerships have opened up funding sources that weren't available to us before. Our sustainable approach has reduced costs and increased property values. And our community focus has created stability that luxury developments never could. James Harrison sat down heavily, watching as his last chance at regaining control slipped away. The shareholders were nodding, some even smiling, clearly won over by the combination of ethical vision and solid financial returns. I move to vote on the continuation of our current direction, a major shareholder called out. The results speak for themselves. The vote was overwhelming. HD New Era would continue on its new path, with Emma Collins at the helm. As the meeting concluded, Victoria approached James, who sat alone, staring at his folded hands. You know, James, she said quietly, success isn't always about being at the top. Sometimes it's about learning to see the value in others, regardless of their position. She placed a small box of chocolate truffles on the table beside him. These were always your favorite when you thought no one knew who was buying them. As Victoria walked away, James opened the box, remembering all the times he'd secretly bought truffles from the elderly vendor outside his restaurant, never knowing it was Victoria Blackwood herself. The lessons he'd failed to learn were now transforming the very company he'd built. Emma stood by the window, watching the sun play off the buildings of London. The city was changing, becoming more inclusive, more sustainable, more human. And it had all started with a simple box of chocolates and the courage to see people for who they really were, not just what they appeared to be. 1 month after the shareholders' meeting, Emma stood in the newly completed community centre at the Riverside development. Children played in the reading corner, while elderly residents attended a gardening workshop in the adjacent greenhouse. The space hummed with the kind of energy that no luxury development could ever achieve, the vibrant pulse of a real community. The waiting list for residences has grown to over 3,000 families, Diana reported, walking beside Emma as they toured the facility. And we've had inquiries from development companies in Paris, Berlin, and Barcelona about implementing our community-integrated model. Emma paused to watch a group of residents tending to the rooftop garden, where vegetables and herbs grew in neat rows. Have the final numbers come in from the first quarter? Even better than projected, Diana smiled, pulling up the figures on her tablet. The reduced maintenance costs combined with the steady rental income have pushed our profit margins 15% above traditional luxury developments. The ethical investment funds are practically begging to be part of our next project. They made their way to a small cafe on the ground floor, one of several community-owned businesses operating within the development. The young barista, a local resident who had completed their business training program, greeted them warmly. Victoria was already there, seated at a corner table with a familiar box of chocolate truffles. "I thought it was time for a proper celebration," she said, as Emma and Diana joined her. "The truffles that started it all," Emma smiled, taking one, "though I suppose we should be serving them in all our community cafes now." "Actually," Victoria's eyes twinkled, "I've been thinking about that. The recipe was Charles's grandmother's, you know. Perhaps it's time to share it with our communities. Let them start their own chocolate-making businesses." The idea sparked something in Emma's mind. Not just chocolates. What if we created a proper business incubator program? Help residents start their own enterprises within our developments. Diana was already taking notes. We could partner with local business schools, offer mentorship programs. Their discussion was interrupted by a news alert on their phones. James Harrison had just announced his retirement from the real estate industry. The article mentioned that he would be focusing on personal growth and community service. "Speaking of personal growth," Victoria said, sliding a newspaper across the table, "have you seen this?" The article was about a new charitable foundation being established by Harrison, focused on providing business education and startup funding for underprivileged entrepreneurs. The photo showed him serving food at a community kitchen, his familiar arrogant expression replaced by something softer, more thoughtful. "People can surprise you," Emma mused, remembering her own journey from mid-level executive to CEO. "Sometimes they just need to be shown a different way." Victoria nodded approvingly. "Which brings us to why I really wanted to meet today. The board has approved your proposal for international expansion, but with a condition. They want you to establish a leadership training program." "Like your chocolate truffle test?" Emma asked, amused. "Similar principle, different execution," Victoria smiled. "We want to identify and nurture leaders who understand that true success comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down." The afternoon sun streamed through the cafe windows, illuminating the bustling community space. Children ran past on their way to after-school programs, elderly residents gathered for their book club, and young entrepreneurs worked on laptops, planning their own small businesses. "You know," Emma said, watching the scene before her, "when I was selling chocolates with you outside the Golden Fork, I never imagined anything like this." "Sometimes the best dreams are the ones we haven't even dared to imagine yet," Victoria replied. "Now tell me about your plans for the Paris project. I hear you're incorporating urban farming on a scale never attempted before." Emma's eyes lit up as she began to outline her vision. The rooftop gardens at Riverside were just the beginning. She saw entire neighborhoods transformed into green, sustainable communities where people of all backgrounds could thrive. Diana's tablet buzzed with another update. More international investors wanting to be part of HD New Era's revolution in urban development. The company that James Harrison had built on exclusivity and luxury was now leading a global movement in sustainable, inclusive community development. As the day drew to a close, Emma took one last walk through the development. Families were returning home from work and school, the community kitchen was preparing for its evening cooking class, and the gardens were being tended by residents who had discovered a passion for urban farming. This was more than just a real estate development, it was a blueprint for the future. And as she watched the sun set over London, Emma Collins knew that her journey from selling chocolates to transforming cities was really just beginning. The true test of leadership wasn't in winning battles in boardrooms, but in creating spaces where everyone had the chance to succeed. Victoria joined her for the final inspection, both women now comfortable in the silence of shared understanding. The chocolate truffle test had found not just a new CEO, but a new way of thinking about success, community, and the true meaning of luxury. The future stretched out before them, filled with possibilities that even Emma hadn't dared to dream of yet. But that was the beauty of it all. Sometimes the sweetest successes come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. The Paris sun cast long shadows across the Champs-Élysées as Emma Collins concluded her presentation to a room full of international urban development leaders. 1 year after the transformation of Harrison Development into HD New Era, she was no longer just changing London, she was helping to reshape cities across Europe. "The success of our community-integrated model isn't just about buildings," she explained, showing slides of the Riverside development. "It's about creating a new framework for urban living, one that brings together people from all walks of life. and gives them the tools to build their own success stories. In the audience, Victoria Blackwood sat beside Diana, both women watching with pride as Emma commanded the attention of some of the world's most influential developers. The young woman who had once shared lunch breaks with a disguised street vendor was now teaching others how to transform urban spaces into thriving communities. After the presentation, during the reception, an elderly French developer approached Emma. "Mademoiselle Collins," he said, his accent thick but his English perfect, "I must confess, I was skeptical when I heard about your methods. But what you've achieved, it reminds me of something my grandmother used to say about building communities, not just buildings." The man introduced himself as Jean-Paul Dubois, one of France's most respected architects and urban planners. "Would you join me for coffee? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." At a small cafe overlooking the Seine, Jean-Paul shared his story. 50 years ago, I tried to implement something similar to what you're doing now. Integration of social classes, sustainable living, community ownership. But the time wasn't right. People couldn't see past the profit margins. Emma listened intently as he pulled out a worn leather portfolio. "These were my original designs. I've kept them all these years, hoping someone would understand their value." As she looked through the yellowed papers, Emma's eyes widened. Jean-Paul's designs from half a century ago eerily mirrored many of the principles she was implementing now, but with innovations she hadn't considered. "Your vertical farming system," she breathed, studying one particularly detailed drawing. "It's brilliant. And these community spaces, they're interconnected in a way that naturally encourages social interaction." Victoria, who had joined them, leaned in to examine the designs. "These could revolutionize our current models," she observed. "Jean-Paul, would you consider joining our international advisory board?" The elderly architect's eyes misted over. After all these years, to see these ideas finally coming to life, it would be an honor. Later that evening, in her hotel suite, Emma held a video conference with her leadership training program participants. Young executives from London, Barcelona, Berlin, and now Paris appeared on the screen, each sharing updates on their community development projects. "Remember," Emma advised them, "the true measure of your success isn't in the height of your buildings or the profit margins. It's in the lives you transform, the communities you help build." Diana entered with an urgent message. "Emma, you need to see this." She handed over her tablet, displaying news from London. James Harrison had just donated his entire fortune to establish a foundation for sustainable community development. "He asked if you would consider being on the foundation's board," Diana added quietly. Emma sat back, surprised but pleased. It seemed the lessons learned over chocolate truffles had reached farther than anyone expected. Victoria, who had been quietly observing, smiled. "You know, Emma, when I started my little chocolate truffle test, I hoped to find one person who understood the true meaning of leadership. Instead, we've started a movement." The night view of Paris sparkled beyond the windows, a city on the verge of its own transformation. Emma's phone buzzed with messages from developers in New York, Singapore, and Dubai, all eager to learn about the HD New Era model. "We're going to need more leadership trainers," Emma mused, looking at the growing list of interested parties. "And I think I know just how to test them." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Chocolate truffles?" "Not quite," Emma smiled, "but something similar. Each candidate will spend time working in our community centers, learning firsthand about the people their decisions will affect. No disguises needed, just real interactions with real communities." The idea sparked an immediate discussion about expanding the training program globally. Jean-Paul offered his Paris workshop as a training center, while other developers began proposing locations in their own cities. As the night wore on, Emma stood at her window watching the city of light. In every twinkling light, she saw the potential for transformation. The little chocolate stand outside the Golden Fork had grown into something far beyond anyone's expectations, a new way of thinking about urban development, about leadership, about community. And somewhere in London, in the bustling community centre of the Riverside development, a new batch of chocolate truffles was being made in the culinary training program. Their recipe a reminder of how the sweetest changes often come from the most unexpected places. The future stretched out before them, filled with possibilities that even Emma hadn't imagined. But that was the beauty of it all. Sometimes the best dreams are the ones we discover along the way, shared over chocolate truffles and built one community at a time. 5 years had passed since a simple box of chocolate truffles had changed the landscape of urban development forever. The Riverside development had become a model studied by universities worldwide, and HD New Era's community-integrated approach had transformed neighborhoods across 3 continents. On a warm summer evening, the development's central plaza was filled with people gathering for a special celebration. Fairy lights twinkled in the trees of the community garden, while the aroma of fresh chocolate truffles wafted from the culinary school's display. Emma Collins stood at the podium, looking out at the faces before her. In the front row sat Victoria Blackwood, elegant as ever, beside Jean-Paul Dubois, who had flown in from Paris. Throughout the crowd were residents from all walks of life, families who had found their first real home, entrepreneurs who had started businesses in the community spaces, elderly residents who had discovered new purpose in the intergenerational programs. 5 years ago, Emma began, this space was nothing more than an architect's drawing and a dream. Today it's home to over 5,000 people, hosts 200 community-owned businesses, and has become a blueprint for sustainable urban development worldwide. She gestured to the buildings around them, where rooftop gardens flourished and solar panels gleamed. But the true measure of our success isn't in the structures we've built, it's in the communities we've helped create. From his seat in the middle of the crowd, James Harrison listened intently. The years had softened his features, and his foundation had become a major partner in HD New Era's global initiatives. Beside him sat Sarah, Emma's sister, now head of the company's medical outreach programs. Victoria took the podium next. When my husband Charles and I started selling sweets from a cart in East London, we learned that true success comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down. Today, that lesson has transformed not just one company, but the very way we think about urban development. The celebration continued into the evening. In one corner, Jean-Paul showed a group of young architects his original designs, now being implemented in cities around the world. At the culinary school's booth, residents learned to make the famous chocolate truffles that had started it all, the recipe now a cherished part of the community's heritage. Diana, who had become HD New Era's Global Operations Director, approached Emma with a tablet. The latest figures are in. Our model has been adopted in 50 cities worldwide. Over 1 million people now live in HD New Era-inspired communities. Emma smiled, watching a group of children play in the plaza. And how many chocolate truffles have we given away? Countless, Diana laughed, though I think Victoria's original ones still taste the best. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Victoria joined them. You know, Emma, when I started my little test outside the Golden Fork, I hoped to find someone who understood that business could be both profitable and humane. Instead, I found someone who showed the world that they should never have been separate in the first place. The 3 women looked out over the plaza, where James Harrison was now helping serve chocolate truffles to residents, his transformation as complete as the development around them. Nearby, international developers chatted with local shop owners, learning firsthand about the benefits of community integration. It's time, Victoria said softly, placing a small box in Emma's hands. Inside was the original truffle recipe, handwritten by Charles Blackwood himself. The next generation of leaders needs its own test. I trust you'll know how to use this wisely. Emma held the recipe carefully, understanding its true value. It wasn't just instructions for making chocolates, it was a reminder that the smallest acts of kindness could spark the greatest changes. As the evening drew to a close, residents gathered for a community photograph. The camera captured not just faces, but a legacy of transformation, of community, of the power of seeing people for who they truly are. The sun set over London, its rays catching the solar panels and green roofs of HD New Era developments across the city. In offices worldwide, young leaders were learning the importance of community and kindness. In developments on every continent, people from all walks of life were finding homes, opportunities, and purpose. And somewhere, in every HD New Era development, there was always a box of chocolate truffles waiting to be shared, a sweet reminder that the greatest changes often come wrapped in the most humble packages. Emma stood in the plaza long after the celebration had ended, watching the lights of the community she had helped build. The chocolate truffle test had found not just a new CEO, but a new way of thinking about success, about community, about the true meaning of luxury. Victoria's final words of the evening echoed in her mind. Sometimes the sweetest success isn't in what we build, but in who we help others become. The future stretched out before them, filled with endless possibilities. But now they knew. It wasn't just about building buildings or making profits. It was about creating spaces where dreams could flourish, where communities could thrive, and where everyone had the chance to discover their own sweet success.